Uhuru. We're here at this national conference on the other wars because of what Comrade O'Malley called the American white left's historical defect that, he wrote, prevents it from giving genuine, practical, and material solidarity to the national liberation struggles of Africans and other peoples within the United States. Comrade O'Malley is correct in this general assessment. Some white leftist organizations have been more defective than others, to the point that some of them have become totally useless to our movement, and that's why we don't go to their events. There are other white left groupings that are very conscientious and sensitive about racial issues, meaning they talk about it a lot. But in the end, they have also failed to meet the test of providing practical and material solidarity to our black struggle. Some people would say, well, so what? What else is new? We could make the same general case about whites in the labor movement, whose failure to invest resources in organizing in the South for so many decades was unquestionably rooted in the issue of race. That decision, that refusal to offer genuine, practical, and material solidarity to black laboring people in the South who were anxious to join unions, allowed that region of the country to remain a bastion of the bosses. White labor's defects regarding race led it to dig its own grave. Something very similar is happening in at least some sectors of the white anti-war movement. We in the Black Coalition, the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations, see the fight against US imperialism as central to our organizational existence. We are for peace with justice, not a peace agreement with imperialism. As anti-imperialists, we are also internationalists in the best sense of the word. Our job is not just to mobilize our own people, although that is our central mission, but to ally ourselves with other peoples and other organizations that seek the end of imperialism. That is what anti-imperialists do. They act in reciprocal and mutual support of each other on the basis of solidarity. It's really not a very complicated subject. Solidarity requires that allies see the world in substantially the same way, not in every respect, but on the important things, there must be some commonality. You share some commonality of vision. The actions we undertake with others in solidarity is based on this shared vision on matters of core importance, such as which wars against the people deserve resources and attention, material solidarity. But you can't forge effective ties of solidarity with people that, for all the white reasons, I said white reasons, think that they are inherently in possession already of the correct vision of the state of the world and what we should do about it. That includes which wars are important enough to command their attention, and even whether to recognize certain situations as being wars at all. And that's basically the focus of my little talk. In deeds and in practice, much of the white left shows that it believes that Somalia is an unimportant war, if it is a war at all. They believe that Congo is just a very, very sad place where millions of Africans mysteriously kill each other, but that it is not a proxy US imperialist war. They believe that Haiti is not a war, it's a tragedy. And they are quite certain that war is not being waged on black people here in the United States. Native Americans, well, they believe nobody's made war on them for many moons. Dead Mexicans in the desert are heartbreaking, but they're not casualties in a centuries-long war. These conflicts, according to these people, are not really wars unless they recognize them as wars. Now, if this conference were just an excuse to vent our spleen at white people on the left, it would not be worth having. But the subject of other wars is critically important for us to discuss, and for a number of reasons. First, we live in a world in which Eurocentric thinking is hegemonic. It permeates every nook and cranny of the American conversation. White supremacist assumptions are built into every news story that we see and read and hear, and that includes the most basic fundamentals of the story, which is why is it important and who is it important to? Even dedicated revolutionaries need periodically to come to conferences like this to fumigate their minds and purge themselves of the layers and layers of Euro thought and corporate thinking that accumulate from our daily exposure to their media. Otherwise, we wind up thinking that what is important to CNN is also what's important to the human race, and that is not the case. Therefore, when we present a critique of the white left, we are also helping each other in the Black is Back coalition to avoid unconsciously buying into the white corporate media's narrative of what is important to the world. Our, excuse me, our obligation to ourselves and to our potential allies is to constantly re-examine the world as it exists, or else we are of no use to anybody, including ourselves. Our diligent and critical analysis, in addition to the practical work that all of us do, is what gives us the moral right to challenge the white left as we are today. Which brings us to another important reason that we're having this conference on the other wars. These other wars that the white left gives such a low priority and the white corporate media virtually ignore may be, as Comrade O'Malley says, the very struggles that have critical significance for the continued survival of imperialism. If we are not looking at these wars, we are not looking at imperialism's Achilles heel. And we do not want imperialism to hang around any second longer than it needs to. So everybody that is serious about defeating imperialism has to go beyond the very short white left list of wars. This is a narrow list that is comprised of wars that either put American soldiers at risk or that involve oil or Israel or both, or fit into the war on Islamic terror scenario that is an invention of the imperialists themselves. The most compelling example of neglected wars, a situation that I believe does go to what is most critical to the survival of imperialism, is the war against the Democratic Republic of Congo. The bulk of the white left and the larger white world do not recognize the slaughter that has killed 6 million Congolese since the mid-90s as another US imperialist war. They are more inclined to call it a civil war, which it is for the most part not. The carnage in the Congo only looks like a civil war to people that think all Central Africans are alike. At root, the genocide in Congo is the result of a US proxy war. And that proxy war is itself part of a long-term US strategy to create chaos in those parts of Africa that the Americans cannot directly control. If they can't control it directly, they control it by proxy. And if they can't control it even by proxy, they create chaos. The genocide in Congo is a proxy US war that is part of that US strategy to create and impose chaos on much of the African continent. And if you don't understand that, then you can't be an effective opponent of US imperialism as it acts out in Africa. Congo has seen genocide before, a Holocaust under the Belgian King Leopold in the latter part of the 1800s, and it went on until deep into the 20th century. That claimed as many lives as the more recent Holocaust in Congo that we know of. The second genocide that began in the mid-90s begins with an invasion by America's two most belligerent client states in Africa, and that is Rwanda and Uganda. Those regimes have been armed to the teeth by Washington, and they act as US mercenaries and hitmen all over the continent. They are subservient to America's demands, and they act under US protection. Their wars are, by definition, US wars, because they are agents of the United States. A United Nations report that was issued late last year, I think it was in November, charged that Rwandan and Ugandan militaries are culpable in the wholesale and systematic slaughter of Congolese and of Rwandan Hutu refugees. Friends of the Congo and many others believe that Rwanda and Uganda and their invasions are ultimately responsible for the genocide in Congo. Yet, to date, the United States has done nothing to even reprimand its clients in Kigali and in Kampala because they were working under orders. Their assignment was to secure the minerals of the Eastern Congo and to prevent any Congolese government, any Congolese central government, from exercising control over these areas and over these minerals and taxing them and making the corporations that profit from them accountable to the people of Congo. Rwanda and Uganda, of course, got their cut from these minerals. But Rwanda and Uganda don't process coltan. They don't process the things that go into every cell phone in the world and into sophisticated weapon systems. Only multinational corporations can do that. And as 6 million Congolese were murdered, the supply of coltan and other Congolese minerals kept flowing without a hitch. It was a smooth operation, and it kept on flowing through Ugandan and Rwandan hands and on to its final corporate destination. That is the reason that millions of Congolese had to die. The genocide in Congo was the result of a deliberate and long-standing US policy. This US policy, this war against the people of the Congo, has been in effect ever since President Eisenhower ordered the execution of Patrice Lumumba. That was one of his last acts in office. 3 decades later, when America's hand-picked strongman, Mobutu, was losing his grip on the Congo, the US initiated its strategy of chaos, culminating in the invasion by Rwanda and Uganda. The Congo is not a mysterious place where Africans mysteriously kill each other.
Take the covers off, man.
Chaos and manufactured wars and mass slaughter are US policy on the continent. They are not byproducts of US policy. They are US policy. Yes. When the Portuguese colonialists lost their grip on Angola and Mozambique, the US stepped in to fund and direct Jonas Savimbi's war against the MPLA government. And they funded and directed Renamo's terrorism against Frelimo. There was, by then, very little chance that Savimbi or Renamo could actually seize control of Angola or Mozambique. That was not going to happen. The purpose of these US wars was to create chaos, to make these countries scream in pain until their new governments came to an accommodation with US and European corporations. And they did. And if you wonder about Angola's behavior today, that's why they had to come to an accommodation to somehow end the US war of terror against Angola and Mozambique. Those struggles are routinely referred to as wars of liberation from Portuguese colonialism. But once the Portuguese collapsed, they became US wars against the people of Angola and Mozambique. And the US stands ready at any time to renew those wars. We're told that the US is also not at war with Somalia, that it's only supporting a provisional government in Mogadishu, the capital city. But of course, there is no government in Mogadishu. All there is a rump faction that was pulled together and paid for by the United States. And that rump faction controls only a little neighborhood. It would not even exist at all except for US-financed mercenary hitmen from Uganda and Burundi, who operate under the facade of the African Union. An earlier chapter of this war against Somalia ended with Black Hawk Down. You've all seen the movie. That phase of this never-ending war began in 2006, this next phase, the latest phase, when the US instigated the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia. That invasion was supported by American Special Forces, the US Indian Ocean Fleet, and US fighters and bombers and drones. Ethiopia, which was too poor and caught up in its own rebellions to sustain that invasion, withdrew, and it withdrew with heavy casualties, but not before creating what the United Nations called the worst humanitarian crisis in Africa, worse crisis than Darfur. But the Americans persisted even after the Ethiopians withdrew. They persisted because this really was their war. They propped up that puny, phony little government in Mogadishu, and they threatened to starve out the surrounding countryside in order to get at the Shabab. The Americans and their puppets can't pacify Somalia. But they don't see their failure to pacify Somalia as a defeat. We sometimes make fun of the United States for not being able to beat probably only a couple of tens of thousands, and not many tens, of the Shabab. But the Americans don't see that as a defeat. Remember, the Americans cannot exert direct or indirect control over a region. And when they can't exert direct or indirect control, they impose chaos by means of war. And so they see themselves as being successful in Somalia because they have successfully imposed chaos by means of war. In Somalia, the chaos provides the United States with an excuse to militarize the whole of the Horn of Africa, which is now an active theater of the war on terror. That Somali quagmire, as some people might see it, actually is quite useful to the United States. And as long as it remains chaotic, as long as the United States can keep it chaotic, the United States has the excuse to make the whole region part of its war on terror. This is a regional U.S. offensive, and that offensive is directed from the U.S. military base in Djibouti, which borders on Somalia. It is a myth. It is a myth that AFRICOM does not have a headquarters on the African continent. It does have a headquarters, and it is in Djibouti. The U.S. military only last week bragged that U.S. operations against Libya were under the control of AFRICOM and its operational base in Djibouti. So we see that the U.S. is not only at war with Somalia, it has enlisted Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda, and Djibouti in that war. Then why does the bulk of what calls itself the American anti-war movement, why are they not waving placards and banners demanding U.S. out of Somalia and U.S. out of the Horn of Africa? Why is this American war not right up there with Iraq and with Pakistan and with Afghanistan? Where is the solidarity? Not with us, but with Somalia. We must ask the same question of the Congressional Black Caucus. And we have to ask that same question of the so-called traditional black leadership. So now we come to that other war that is not a war, the war against Haiti. I'm not going to lecture this audience about the constant wars that Europe and North America have waged against Haiti. The Black is Back coalition needs no education on that subject. The coalition's practice speaks for itself. But none of us have ever heard the US corporate media or the main currents of the anti-war tendency in the United States speak of an American war against Haiti. You probably have never heard that term, the American war against Haiti. What war? Didn't the United States just oversee an election in Haiti? Hasn't the first black president gone all over South America last week bragging about how the United States has brought democracy to Haiti? So in that case, how can we be speaking of a war against Haiti, not a US war? This latest chapter in America's unceasing hostilities against Haiti begins with a war. The US invasion of Haiti, a warlike act, if one could imagine any other, in 2004. The United States assembled a force in the Dominican Republic. It armed that force with brand new US weapons. It unleashed it in a terror spree to spread chaos in the country, and then used the chaos that it had created to land US forces in the capital of Haiti. Then they took the democratically elected president prisoner, and they flew him in an American aircraft to a US ally's former colony in Africa, where he was held in a French military base, and then they enforced his exile, 7 years of exile to South Africa, kind of like what the British did to Napoleon the first time around. The Americans occupied the country, and they put it in the hands of thugs and maniacs and criminals, and they stripped Haiti of all meaningful rights and sovereignty. Then the US transferred the occupation of Haiti, like you would transfer a captive of war to a compliant United Nations, which continued to hold Haiti by force of arms. Now that is a war by anybody's definition. The Americans actually treated Haiti worse than they treated Germany and Japan after that Second World War. They outlawed its largest and most popular political party. That reduced the country to a kind of protectorate, like Namibia under racist South Africa. Then they imposed elections that the people didn't want. and which most of them boycotted in order to show that they didn't want those elections. Those elections were already rigged because the biggest party in Haiti was excluded. And then they rigged those elections too, in order to produce the two right-wing candidates that the United States favored. It is rigging and rigging and rigging over and over again. They do it with a straight face, and Obama goes to Chile and brags about this. All this, these elections, all the machinations in between, can only be seen as part and parcel of the invasion of 2004. Those events are inseparable. The war started in 2004 is not over. It has all the characteristics of a colonial war, a war to make Haiti into a colony. And yet, we can't get the main part of the anti-war movement to acknowledge that the US has been at war with Haiti. And I must add, we can't get the Congressional Black Caucus or the Black misleadership class to acknowledge that either. So it's not just beating up on the white anti-war movement. United States history in Latin America is one of unremitting aggression. Under President James Monroe, the US proclaimed to Europe that it had the right of a monopoly on aggression against its Latin neighbors. That was the Monroe Doctrine. By the 1970s, the US had imposed military dictatorships on most of South and Central America, and that horror is a very recent memory for all Latin Americans. Today, the only major puppet state of the United States in South America is Colombia, the third largest recipient of US so-called aid in the world, and the only South American home for important US bases. There has been a sea change in that part of the world in the last 30 years. Latin America has become, on the whole, a bright spot on the planet, a place that is attempting to create regional solidarity in opposition to the old Washington consensus. But that does not deter the United States from trying to implement its strategy, the same old strategy of spreading chaos as a kind of warfare against regions that it cannot directly control. It is essentially the same intent and policy in Latin America as in Africa. Colombia was hijacked by the United States decades ago as a center of destabilization of its neighbors. It is a base for secessionist movements, movements that are coordinated and manipulated and damn near invented by the United States. Those secessionist movements are located in Bolivia and Ecuador. Colombia has an army twice as large as Venezuela. You wouldn't know that from US corporate media reports. You would think that Venezuela is threatening Colombia. But Colombia's army is twice as big, and that does not count the paramilitaries who are criminals and whose numbers about match those of the Colombian army. It is very clear, it is understood that if there is a US invasion of Venezuela, it is a war against its own people on behalf of the United States. And that must be considered a US war. What Colombia does to its people at the behest of the United States and in the pay of the United States is an act of the United States. The United States wages war against the Colombian people. US imperialism, as proof of the intensity of that war, we just have to look at the numbers. Colombia now has the distinction, and I just heard about this, the distinction of being the country with the largest population of internally displaced people in the world. More displaced people than in Sudan, more displaced people than in Afghanistan, more displaced people than in Iraq, more displaced people than anywhere else in the world. That's 5.2 million people. And half of those people were just recently displaced under the recently completed term of Alvaro Uribe, who's the Harvard-educated ex-president who was the darling, the favorite, the cultivated personality of the United States. Who are these displaced people who were lucky to leave their homes with their lives? You know who they are.
Yes.
They are disproportionately indigenous persons and Afro-Colombians who've been terrorized out of areas that are coveted by multinational corporations. Most of those corporations are based in the United States. The greatest displacement in the world today is occurring in this hemisphere. Colombia is a US proxy against US descended and native African descended and native indigenous people right here in the Americas, and that is the same war that has been waged for 5 centuries. So at this point, I think it's necessary to put the whole story in a deeper context, a deeper perspective, and it is the context of a 500-year war, a war that is ongoing. We are still in the midst of this 500-year war that began, let's call the date 1492, when Western Europeans broke out of their subcontinent to begin what would become a war against the rest of planet Earth. In the process, they would acquire enough riches by stealing the resources and the labor and the very bodies of the peoples they conquered in these centuries of uninterrupted warfare. They would be enabled to make a transition to a mature capitalist system. As they subdued and erased and enslaved various non-European peoples in the world, they proceeded to establish a global racial hierarchy that is still with us. Their predations on the rest of humanity would take on the characteristics in time, and in a very short space of time, the characteristics of a race war. The world that we inhabit today was shaped by this 500 years war, that was at least partially a race war. It was the Europeans' own justifications for that half a millennium of global warfare that gave it the characteristics of a race war. In other words, the Europeans saw it and said they saw it, that is, their contact with, their wars against other people, as a race war. It's not us saying it, they said it contemporaneously with those wars. These centuries of European warfare and forcible subjugation of the colored peoples of the planet shaped the world as we know it today. Very early on in their rampage, Europeans declared that their military and economic supremacy on the planet was part of the natural order of things. These were not conflicts between civilizations, these European wars against other peoples. These were the advance of civilization. Every contact they had with other peoples, every time they crushed another civilization, it was depicted as an advance of civilization, the advance of Western civilization, which then became, of course, white civilization, and now they credit it with being all of humanity's civilization. They conquer, subjugate, enslave, and make relentless war against the rest of the world, and they call that progress and civilization. The great white American imperialist Teddy Roosevelt, who was certainly speaking for the bulk of the white Americans of his era, saw the extinction of the Red Indian, that's what he called them, as a natural consequence of the Indians' contact with the white man. Africans were said to be doomed to eternal barbarity if it were not for the white man. It would follow then, of course, the logic would say, that the forcible suppression of these people was an inevitable and benign process. And if this is how you're framing it, then you're not engaged in war at all. These are not wars. Certainly these are not wars in the sense that, let's say, the Napoleonic Wars were wars. These Napoleonic Wars and other European wars were wars between equals. But the contact with the non-white world was not a war between equals. It was civilization versus barbarians and lesser peoples. I don't think that if you ask the average college-educated person who has a passing knowledge of history to name an African, a war fought by Europeans against Africans, I don't believe that they could name one battle. They could name all kinds of European wars. They could name wars fought in Asia, but they couldn't name one battle fought against Africans because this conflict, this contact, these conquests were not thought of as wars. Most white people, certainly most white people in the United States, believe that they deserve the spoils that have been handed down to them through these conquests. And they are not unhappy with the results of the European breakout 5 centuries ago. Wow. They do not think that it is a history of unrelenting aggression, or that their white privilege is the result of 500 years of merciless, aggressive warfare. And even on the left, most whites cling to their privilege of deciding what constitutes war and which wars should be ended and under what condition. So now we're coming to the tail end, the war at home, because he's showing me a sign. We find that the greatest resistance among whites is to the concept and even the very idea that the United States wages continuous war against black and brown and native people here at home. There is little real recognition that Africa was penetrated by Europeans through warfare, and that the depopulation of Africa through the slave trade was a form of warfare, that chattel slavery was a form of systematic warfare, that the rule of Jim Crow through white terror was warfare, that mass black incarceration and relentless police containment of black populations is warfare, that black people have been waged war upon since first setting foot on these shores until this very moment. This does not compute with much of white America, including much of the white left. Slavery in the United States was a constant state of war. Every white male was expected to do patrol duty in the slave states to prevent black rebellions. There was a constant state of vigilance and military preparedness. Collective reprisals were exacted at the first hint of black resistance to slavery. The militarization, the war footing of white society under slavery was profound. It, in fact, defined white slave society when compared with northern societies. It accounts for the early successes of the Confederates in the Civil War, since slave states had white male society constantly and deeply involved in a permanent militia war with slaves. These people were veterans before they put on that Confederate uniform. They'd already been in the militia, the paddy rollers, in a war with the black population. Denmark Vesey certainly thought that he was at war. Nat Turner knew he was at war. And the white folks that killed Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner knew that they were at war too. They killed untold tens of thousands in their slavery wars, one at a time and sometimes hundreds at a time. Black Reconstruction was crushed by means of war. And by that I mean race war, because that was the character that it took. In Louisiana and parts of South Carolina, the warfare resembled El Salvador at the height of those wars, with white armies scouring the country, sometimes fighting pitched battles with blacks, and always looking for a massacre. White supremacy in post-Reconstruction and Jim Crow were enforced by white terror, not the terror of individual whites or small white gangs, but the white community acting in concert. Thousands of whites would gather for the festivities of black lynchings and burnings, and they would bring their wives, and they would bring their girlfriends, and they'd bring their kids. This was a white communal war against black people, and can only be understood as such, and all you have to do is look at the pictures to see the carnival atmosphere around the burning black body, and you know that that was a race war and a communal one. It was not individual terror, it was white people's terror against black people. That's the kind of war, that's the most horrible war imaginable, and that's where we come from, those kinds of wars. In the North and in the South, before the Harlem riot of 1935, virtually all of the race riots in the United States were in fact mass white pogroms against blacks, mostly involving the police and sometimes even involving the United States military. People in this room remember when we responded to being made war upon by waging war back in hundreds of cities during the 60s. At that point, white folks started seriously worrying about war, and they said so. War was in the air, war was in the newspapers, because they were worried because they had lost their monopoly on violence, which then caused them to massively militarize their urban police forces. They brought in armored vehicles and SWAT teams and all the accoutrement of an army of occupation. Even in the rural South, in counties that used to get by with a sheriff and maybe 2 or 3 deputies, all of a sudden they had 20 full-time deputies, all paid for by Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon's governments. The United States was arming to the teeth because it had lost its monopoly on violence. Its response to black people standing up and being human beings was to further militarize the country. And that's not a war. When you increase the militarization of society, certainly you must be on some kind of war footing. It's not just us saying that we're being waged war upon. It's the people who buy the tanks. It's the people who staff the SWAT teams. Those people say that we're on a war footing. It took hundreds of rebellions at the cost of thousands of lives, if the tally were ever told, to simply assert humanity for black people during that period, during the 60s. And then the US government unleashed another level of warfare in the form of COINTELPRO. And they declared that the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was the principal threat to the internal security of the United States. Now that is war talk, and they prosecuted that as a war against the Black Panther Party and lots of other folk. Next came the real payback for the Black Freedom Movement, and that was mass black incarceration. It was white society's way of saying, if you blacks won't stay in your place, we got a place for you. We can date the inception of mass black incarceration as a national policy of the United States to roughly 1970. Since that time, the US prison population has increased sevenfold, and the racial ratio of incarceration has flipped. Before 1970, 70% roughly of US prison inmates were white, and the others were black and brown. Now that ratio is reversed, 70% black and brown, maybe 30% white. This phenomenon of mass incarceration is not regional. And in fact, what is so striking about it is how universal it is. It exists in every state of the country, big states and small states. And in fact, the gap in sentencing and arrests and all these indices of the criminal justice system, the gap seems larger in the small states than in places like Mississippi and South Carolina. It seems that when you are in a state like Iowa, where there's just a small black population and it's concentrated, the cops have to keep on going back to the same little place in order to arrest enough black people to keep them satisfied. So the same black folks keep on getting arrested over and over again, and bigger percentages get arrested. And so it's worse in places like Iowa, believe it or not, than it is in Mississippi, if we're talking about discrepancies of that kind. If the United States is not at war with black people, where did all the prisoners come from? Why are they capturing so many people if we are not at war? If a visitor from another planet came to Earth and discovered that 1 out of every 8 prisoners on the planet is black, then E.T. would immediately ask, who are these black Americans at war with? And that is the logical question. Any man from outer space would ask it. And the answer is, we are at war with the United States of America, or rather, they are at war with us. Talk about infant mortality, black male mortality. If the United States is not at war with blacks, then why are all these bodies laying around? Why is black infant mortality at third world levels and black inner city male longevity on a par with Bangladesh, while white mortality is comparable to Western Europe? Clearly, there's a war going on. These are the casualties. These are the wounded. These are the people who died prematurely. That's warfare. Black wealth. If warring marauders had not plundered us, then how did it happen that we have been stripped of all our resources? It looks like a community that has been systematically looted. The gap between black and white wealth has been growing for the past 30 years. We have not been narrowing the gap. The gap gets bigger and bigger. The gap between black and white wealth now amounts to about $100,000 per household, with black households hovering around $5,000 of wealth. About half of black households have negative wealth. It is as if we lost the war and then were forced to pay reparations to white people. The unchallenged rulers of America, the finance capitalist class, specifically targeted black neighborhoods for destruction prior to the great meltdown of 2008. They pillaged black communities through subprime lending and all kinds of other schemes, and left them hollowed out and looking war-ravaged. In inner cities, half of black men do not have legal jobs, a structural poverty that is built into the black condition by US policies, and that is economic warfare. The numbers, according to the indices that I was quoting before, for Native Americans, those who have avoided Teddy Roosevelt's extinction, are actually worse than they are for black Americans. For Latinos, the numbers are not much better. And Latinos are increasingly treated as enemy aliens, whatever their actual legal status is. If they are Mexican in California and the Southwest, they are enemy aliens in what used to be their own country. And if they are Mexicans of Native American descent, they are enemy aliens in a land that has always been theirs. But I'm not going to speak for Latinos or for Native Americans. They can speak for themselves. They do speak for themselves. We are in solidarity with them as co-combatants in this 500-year-long war. Now, having spent about 20 minutes, or I think the brother said maybe like 30 minutes, beating up on the white left, I want to acknowledge in the House Marilyn Levin and Chris Gavreau. They're from UNAC, that's the United National Anti-War Committee. UNAC is holding its national mobilizations against the war, against Obama's wars, and they say against Obama's wars, not just wars in general. They're holding their national mobilizations on April 9th in New York City, and then April 10th in San Francisco. And I have been told that UNAC is coming out with a statement in solidarity with blacks and Latinos and Latin Americans in the particular historical war that has been waged against us by the United States. And of course, that is the basis, a basis for solidarity. Thank you.